Hello and welcome back. My name is Nathan House and I'm with the Houston Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that would be appreciated. Been a while again. I keep saying that. I keep feeling like I haven't been very consistent, so please forgive me. This time it was because my wife and I were blessed to be able to go to Israel and Rome. We bought those tickets before COVID, but it got canceled. So we were finally able to go, and we were gone for a few weeks, so just got back a few days ago. So anyway, I apologize for the few weeks where we were gone. I want to be back in the book of Joshua here today, and I want to kind of look at the story of Rahab. Now, this is a story that many of us are familiar with. We know that her name appears in the pages of the New Testament a few times. I want to go through this text a little bit, make a few comments, and hopefully make some applications to our lives. Let's go ahead and begin in verse 1 here of Joshua chapter 2. Let's read those first two verses. It says, "And Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, 'Go view the land, especially Jericho.' And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told to the king of Jericho, 'Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land.'" So I want just to begin with this very significant point. Rahab was a woman with a past. Rahab was a woman, in the text calls her a prostitute, and some scholars want to try to remove that. But when you open up the pages of the New Testament, the Greek text, the inspired writers of the New Testament will use the Greek word porne to describe her. So I believe the translation is accurate. She was a prostitute. But what's interesting, and I just want to note this again, is it was a woman with a past. And does that make us uncomfortable? How does that impact us as we consider this woman, Rahab, and especially as we continue to unpack the story a little more, how does her past impact us, or what do we think of her past? Notice then verse 3 through 7 here. "Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, 'Bring out the men who came to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land.' But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and she said, 'True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them.' But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out." So what do we see here? Rahab was a woman of action. Rahab was willing to act. And it's interesting what her actions are and what they did. And so here was a woman who was a pagan, who was not an Israelite, right? I mean, she was not a follower of Yahweh, but she takes these 2 men who were coming to spy out her land, and she protects them. She hides them. And so really this was a very significant act, because this was an act that placed her in direct opposition to the leaders of her city, this fortified city that she was a part of. It set her in opposition to them. And so certainly this would have been an act of treason, right? To be willing to protect those who were coming to spy out your land, who had bad intentions for your land. But why did she do this? Why did Rahab act in this way? Well, the text, which we'll read, says it's because of her faith. It's because she heard, and think about this for a second, she heard a message, maybe message is not the right word, but she heard of the acts of God. She believed the acts of God, and she acted upon that faith, that belief. So she was a woman, and we're going to read verses 8 through 14 here. She was a woman who believed in the great acts of the Lord and acted upon them. And again, that's a very significant thing to note, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But let's go ahead and read verse 8 through 14. "Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to them," watch this, "I know that the Lord has given you the land." She says, "I know that he's given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you." Why did she know this? Why were they afraid? Why did she acknowledge this? Verse 10, "For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. Watch this again. For the Lord your God, look at her conclusion. This is an amazing conclusion. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Wow, what a conclusion. I know the Lord has given you this land. I've heard of his works. I know who he is. And again, when you see the Lord, all capitals, that's the name Yahweh. So she's not using this generic word Elohim or El or some other form for a generic word for God. She uses the name Yahweh. I know that Yahweh. She uses God's name for Yahweh, your God. Your God. He is God. So here she uses the generic form of God, but this is not generic. This is his name. For Yahweh, your God, is God. Now then, verse 12, please swear to me by Yahweh, or however his name was pronounced. We again don't know exactly. Swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you will deal kindly with my father's house, and will give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters. Verse 14. And the men said to her, our life for yours, even to death, if you do not tell this business of ours. Then when Yahweh gives us the land, they believed it too. We will deal kindly and faithfully with you. So what do we see here? Well, first of all, it's kind of interesting. The book of Exodus is a book that was largely performed. The acts were largely performed. The actions of God were largely done to make God known. When you go back and you read Exodus chapter 5, in fact, let's just hop over there real quick. Exodus chapter 5, verse 2, for example. Pharaoh said, who is Yahweh? I do not know who he is. I'm not going to let Israel go. So Pharaoh says, who is this guy? I don't know him. That word, again, I don't know him. Chapter 6, verse 7, look at this. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know. Pharaoh didn't know who God was. God says to the Israelites, you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Then you could go to chapter 7, verse 5. And again, you notice this. Look at what God says again. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And I'm not going to go through all these, but in the book of Exodus, over and over and over, there is this, the actions of God are performed so that people would know who he was, so that the Pharaoh would know who he was, so that the Egyptians would know who he was, so that the Israelites would know who he was. And this woman, Rahab, when she has heard the acts of God, what he has done, the signs he has done, she says, I know who he is. And again, what an amazing conclusion in verse 11 that she comes to. For the Lord, for Yahweh, your God, he is God. She was a pagan, raised in a pagan city, worshiping pagan gods. But when she heard the acts of the true God, her conclusion is just amazing. And then her request in verse 12 through 14, save us alive. Don't destroy us. And it's interesting again that when you open up the pages of the New Testament, she's mentioned 3 times. Let's go back. First, let's go to James, actually. Let's go to James chapter 2 real quickly. And again, we see this. And in the same way was not also Rahab the prostitute. And again, notice what the inspired writer James calls Rahab. He calls her a prostitute. Rahab the prostitute was justified by works. So she's praised for her actions. James, the Lord's brother, praises her for her actions. In the book of Hebrews, she is once again praised in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. And it says, by faith, Rahab the prostitute. And again, notice what the inspired Hebrew writer says. She was a prostitute. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. So she was praised for her works by James, praised for her faith by the writer of the book of Hebrews. And again, it's interesting because there's only 2 women mentioned in the book of Hebrews in this faith chapter, and she's one of them. The other is, of course, Sarah. She was praised for her faith. But then we come to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, and we're reading the genealogy of Jesus Christ, right? And so here it says of who was called Christ. And so this is the genealogy of Christ, beginning in Matthew chapter 1, beginning with Abraham. So Matthew traces the genealogy of Christ, beginning with Abraham. But what's interesting to our discussion today is you notice in verse 5 here, and Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. This is interesting. In the genealogy of Christ, there's only a few women mentioned in the genealogy of Christ. And it's interesting to note who is mentioned. You have Tamar over here, this woman. Go read her story. You have Ruth mentioned here. Go read her story. She was not an Israelite. She had worshipped other gods. Here was Rahab the harlot, a woman with a past, a pagan. And yet she became a woman in the lineage of our Savior Jesus Christ. That's an amazing thing to think about. And again, it kind of begs the question, kind of makes me think about this. And what is more significant? Rahab's past or Rahab's present? What's more significant, our past, that we've made mistakes in our life, or where we are now, where we are going in our life? How do we apply this to our own life, right? I mean, do we beat up ourselves because of our past? Do we restrict our present and our future because we're so caught up with our mistakes? Or what about as we apply this to the lives of others? When somebody else comes into our church and into our assembly and they have a past, how do we respond to them? Do we care more about their past, or do we care more about their present and their future? And here's a very important lesson as we consider the life of Rahab. We could talk about her faith, and it's obviously worth noting in her acts, but I want to make this point before we end, that our past does not define us. Rahab had a past. She moved on from her past. She didn't remain in it. She, by faith, became a child of God and a mother in the very lineage of our Savior, Jesus Christ. You see, by faith, this woman came to believe in Yahweh as creator. Her past didn't define her. Our past does not define us. My past does not define me. I have pasts. I have mistakes. So do you. But our past does not define us. Thank you for your time. God bless.